Yesterday was Equality Day. This is the anniversary of 33 years of the coming into force of the equality provisions of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And by a great coincidence, or probably actually great planning on the part of some of our NGO partners, yesterday I had the great honor of being at a reception to honor 6 women who fought for equality for Indigenous women in Canadian law. Last night we honored Ms. Jeannette Corbière-Laval, Ms. Yvonne Bedard, Senator Sandra Lovelace-Nicholas, Dr. Sharon McIver, Dr. Lynn Gell, and Senator Lillian Dick. 6 women who were described in this way by the Ontario Native Women's Association, quote, "The famous Fives fought to gain recognition for the equal personhood of women in 1929. So too the famous 6 are fighting for recognition of the equal personhood of Indian women. But 88 years after the Privy Council ruled in favour of the famous 5, the famous 6 and the many thousands of Indian women and their descendants whom they represent still do not enjoy equality with their Indian male counterparts under the Indian Act. This is an embarrassment to Canada and a contravention of our human rights obligations." End quote. And so last night they were honoured, including Yvonne Bedard on her 80th birthday. So good that we were able to say thank you to them for fighting so hard. For 40 years, these women fought in court to regain their Indian status and Indian status for their children, which the Indian Act said they would lose if they married a white man. Completely discriminatory, and of course it's not mirrored for men, Indigenous men who marry white women. Only the women were discriminated against. I was very moved to hear the speech in particular of Sharon McIver. She described that she now considers the 45,000 Indigenous kids who regained their First Nation status as a result of Sharon McIver's court case. She calls them her grandchildren, 45,000 grandchildren. But she says 300,000 are yet to be included because the Liberal government has continued to resist full human rights being restored to all Indigenous women in the Indian Act. And, Madam Speaker, you'll remember this vote in the House on June 21st. My colleague, the member from James Bay, Abitibi, Iasku, the EU, moved in tandem with the amendments that were proposed in the Senate to bring full gender equality for Indigenous women into the Indian Act. And to our great shame, the Liberal government voted those amendments down. They said there were unintended consequences. They voted to revert back to discrimination against Indigenous women. This is the 6(1)A all the way amendment, which these famous 6 Indigenous women warriors were asking the government to restore. And so through you, I ask my counterpart on the other side of the hall, why should Indigenous rights for women have to be the subject of consultation? Are they not full human rights?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise to answer the question from the honourable member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. Secondly, I would like to congratulate all of those women that were recognized last evening and many other women across Canada who have and continue to fight hard for gender-based equity in our country, including those within the House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I also want to reiterate our government is absolutely committed to ensuring gender equity for all women in Canada. That includes ensuring sex-based equity for Indigenous women regarding the Indian Act registration. The government is pleased that Bill S3, which finally eliminates all sex-based discrimination from registration provisions in the Indian Act, has now received royal assent. This is a tremendous step forward in this country for reconciliation, for Indigenous women's rights, and for respect and equity in Canada. This includes circumstances prior to 1951, and in fact, the bill remedies sex-based inequities dating back to 1869. While the balance of Bill S3 was brought into force immediately after royal assent, the clause dealing with the 1951 cutoff will be brought into force after the conclusion of the co-design consultations. The government has made it clear that consultation and partnership are essential prerequisites for any major changes involving First Nations. We have set that out from the beginning. This approach is in keeping with its commitment to a renewed, respectful relationship, a partnership based on the recognition of rights, and to the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The effective removal of the 1951 cutoff will require extensive consultations with communities, affected individuals, and experts to ensure we get this right. The government is committed to ensuring that this measure is implemented in the right way, both in terms of First Nations communities and individuals who will become entitled to registration. As Senator Sinclair noted in his speech and in other places regarding Bill S3, he says that while he is somewhat reluctant and that I see us delaying the implementation of the Charter right, he could also see the need to do so because of that competing constitutional obligation to consult. And so he says he was prepared to support the legislation because it enshrines the right, and we would ask that the members of the House of Commons would do the same. Consultations will be focused on identifying additional measures and resources required to do this right, and working in partnership to develop a comprehensive implementation plan. This is a responsible and prudent way to proceed as a government, and we will ensure that the government implements these measures in a way that will eliminate or mitigate any unintended negative consequences for communities and for individuals. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
How could there be unintended consequences of restoring full human rights to Indigenous women? 300,000 remain affected by the fact that the government did not restore full gender equality to the Indian Act. And with respect to the parliamentary secretary, the 6 women who are at the foundation of this case, of the court that forced the government to take this step, they are not happy with what the government has done, and the parliamentary secretary heard them, called out on that last night. So I ask for a 4th time, why would a so-called feminist government need to consult on whether Indigenous women have human rights?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We are the first government in this country to recognize the very need to change the legislation that currently exists in Canada, which have been there for hundreds of years. We are restoring rights to Indigenous women on gender-based equality in this country, and that cannot be denied, as it is clear in the legislation. We are the first government in the history of this country to ever do so, and we have been committed to this process since the very beginning. We are determined to do this. We are determined to do it right, and already with royal assent of the Act of S3, much of that process has already begun as I speak today. We are committed to also changing the relationship that Canada has had with Indigenous people in this country. And in changing that relationship, we have agreed to consult, to do so in a respectful way, to work together as partners. I would ask that the member opposite could understand and accept that.